My name is Tony Alberg. I'm an epidemiologist by training and at the University of South Carolina Arnold School of Public Health. And my charge here to bring this session to a close is talk about the public health implications of e-cigarettes. I'll be focusing on the health effects that have been alluded to so far and delve into some of that. In terms of the outline of what I'm going to follow, I'm actually going to talk a fair bit about the health effects of combustible tobacco cigarettes to provide some context for this conversation before delving into e-cigarettes, the constituents of what users are exposed to, what's known about the health effects, and obviously there's a lot left to learn about that. And then when talking about this issue, to look at e-cigarettes in relation to combustible tobacco cigarette smoking in adults and youth. So I'm going to bring in the adult piece of this. It's hard to talk about this issue without looking at the complete public health perspective. So I'm sure some of you are groaning and rolling your eyes thinking, why talk about the health effects of combustible tobacco cigarettes? That's something we all know about. But I think that to provide the context, it's very important actually to delve into that and refresh our memories. And my guess is that almost every one of you in the room is going to learn something new about what's known today about the health effects of cigarettes. And it's so extensive, so vast, the numbers are so big that we get lost in what the true health effects are. And that's important to really understand what e-cigarettes bring from a public health perspective. Cigarette smoke is, as you know, a highly toxic mixture. Over 7,000 different chemicals have been identified in cigarette smoke. Those chemicals are coming from the tobacco plant itself. They're coming from additives that tobacco companies add to the product, and then lighting it on fire catalyzes a lot of chemical reactions and creates a lot more chemicals. That's a highly, to get the extent of the health effects that are known in cigarettes, a highly toxic mixture that includes over 60 known carcinogens, aldehydes, benzene, metals, nitrosamines, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, just as a few on that list. This is a diagram from the 2014 Surgeon General's report, and that's what I'll be really relying on. That's the last comprehensive review of the health effects of cigarette smoking. And you're not going to be able to see the details of all the diseases here. I'm going to go through those in a rapid fashion, but a few things to highlight. The number of diseases that smoking causes, and you can see they're pointing to the organ systems in the body. Cigarette smoking causes diseases in every major organ system in the human body. Another point to notice is just those diseases that are in bold. Those are the ones that were newly identified as caused by cigarette smoking as of 2014. So the evidence continues to accrue about the health effects of cigarette smoking, and it's an extensive list. If we turn to just cancer alone, you all know that cigarette smoking is the major cause of lung cancer. You may not all know that cigarette smoking is causally associated with 12 different kinds of cancer shown here. And in combination, cigarette smoking is causally responsible using population attributable risk estimates for 48% of all cancer deaths. Cigarette smoking is a major cause of cardiometabolic and cardiovascular disease, coronary heart disease, aortic aneurysm, subclinical atherosclerosis, cerebrovascular disease, or stroke, and newly, as of the 2014 Surgeon General's report, type 2 diabetes. And I'm guessing that is not something that's common knowledge to you. Overall, 20% of all cardiovascular and metabolic disease deaths. So we're talking about the leading cause of death in the United States. Cigarette smoking is a major cause of pulmonary disease, and we're not talking about lung cancer here, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. The fourth leading cause of death in the United States, cigarette smoking causes about 85 to 90% of all chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, reduced lung function, asthma symptoms, wheeze. And then also, very interestingly too, and I'm guessing many of you don't know this, cigarette smoking as a cause of infectious diseases. How could that be? We know that the causes of pneumonia, influenza, tuberculosis are microorganisms, But cigarette smoking, due to its effects on inflammation and immune dysregulation, increases the likelihood of infection given exposure. That's called infectivity. It increases the likelihood of disease given infection. That's called pathogenicity. And it increases the likelihood of severe disease and death given disease, and that's called virulence. So again, a major cause of disease and death from these: pneumonia, influenza, and tuberculosis, such that cigarette smoking is causally associated with 62% of all pulmonary deaths. Cigarette smoking is a cause of adverse reproductive effects, including reduced fertility in women, male sexual dysfunction, erectile dysfunction, preterm delivery, shortened gestation, and ectopic pregnancy. And other health effects, again, emphasizes the causal associations in every major organ system in the human body. If we want to talk about bone, cigarette smoking causally associated with hip fractures, decreased bone density; teeth, causally associated with periodontitis; eyes, causally associated with blindness, cataracts, age-related macular degeneration; joints, causally associated with rheumatoid arthritis; and beyond all that, even before clinical disease is detectable, cigarette smokers have diminished health status, namely they're worse off in almost every measurable parameter compared to a non-cigarette smoker of similar characteristics. That would be heightened inflammation, increased oxidative stress, more likely to be absent from school or work, lower self-rated quality of life, and the list goes on and on. That's for active cigarette smoking. We also have secondhand smoke exposure to attend to. Newly identified in the 2014 Surgeon General's report was a stroke as a causal association, and that's added on to lung cancer and coronary heart disease, which were established long ago as being causally associated with secondhand smoke exposure. Cigarette smoking is also a cause of sudden infant death syndrome. So in total, 41,000 deaths per year in the United States from secondhand smoke exposure. And when we combine all of this, what's known, despite the decreases in smoking prevalence that have been taking place over time, 480,000 deaths per year in the United States, the leading cause of preventable death and premature mortality in the country, responsible for about 1 out of every 5 deaths. So within that context, we move into e-cigarettes and focus specifically on cigarettes. But we need to keep that context in the back of our mind, and that will be a theme that comes up again and again. I'm going to be relying and talking about this material on the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine 2018 report entitled The Public Health Consequences of E-Cigarettes. I was honored to have the opportunity to serve on the committee that developed this report. In thinking about this report now, 2018 seems pretty current for most research topics. This is a really rapidly changing field. So you can see, for example, on the cover of this report, no Juul is present. So the pod-based systems weren't accounted for, and we need to keep in mind, that the content of the information I'm talking about may be a little dated in certain areas, and I'll try to bring up those areas. Also, you should know this is funded through the federal government. This PDF is free, available to you to download if you're interested in the details of the report. To get a hard copy, I think it's $125 or something. This was an evidence-based framework, a committee of experts from different areas: toxicology, basic sciences, behavioral scientists, tobacco control researchers, physicians, epidemiologists, and so on. And there was a framework to rate the evidence as to whether there was enough evidence to make any conclusion at all. In many of the important chronic diseases, there was no evidence to assess. But I'll be focusing mostly on where it was moderate or substantial evidence available. So first, talk about the constituents of e-cigarettes. And they can be grouped primarily into 3 categories: humectants, flavorants, nicotine. So all those products you heard Dr. Thrasher talk about, there's going to be commonalities in terms of the actual constituents of the products, and breaks down pretty much to these categories. For humectants, there's many different humectants that are used, primarily propylene glycol. And here, from out of nowhere, a picture of the king of pop, Michael Jackson. So why would a nerdly professor such as myself put Michael Jackson up on the screen at this important time in the talk? Well, the point is it's not about Michael Jackson. It's about what's behind him. There, you've seen propylene glycol in action before, whether or not you knew it or not. Propylene glycol is what's used to make the fake smoke used in concerts and theatrical plays. And so very little is known about the health effects of inhaling propylene glycol. There was concern by Broadway actors in New York about those who were working in plays where was a lot of fake smoke being used. There was an epidemiologic study done. It was never published. It did show some adverse respiratory health effects. The numbers were too small to be conclusive. And then shown here is from a vaping convention, and you can see the issues there with secondhand vape exposure. Obviously, that's a high density level of exposure, but it brings to bear that issue there for not only the active vapors, but for the secondhand, those exposed to secondhand exposure. And when you heard on the one of the videos, I think it was, refer to formaldehyde and acrolein, those would be coming from the vaporization of the propylene glycol. So that's a bad actor and something to be concerned about. The flavorants that are used, so there's a wide variety of flavorants used in these products in order to achieve the names of the flavors that you heard mentioned by Dr. Thrasher. And so it's very difficult to study and to categorize because of the heterogeneity of the products on the market. But in general, what we can say is that those flavorants are generally recognized as safe by the Food and Drug Administration. So that's the good news. The concerning news is that generally recognized as safe for ingestion. So the big question then is what happens when you heat these flavorants up and then inhale the chemicals into the lungs, and certainly a source of concern. And then we have the nicotine. So, and again, I'm not sure if it was shown or not, many youth users think they're using products that don't contain nicotine. That's generally not true, and the concentrations can be very high. And we know of the adverse health effects of nicotine and are learning more about that in terms of the developing brain. So in terms of the toxicology of the constituents, and this is coming out of the report now, conclusive evidence that most e-cigarette products contain and emit numerous potentially toxic substances. The number, quantity, and characteristics of substances emitted is highly variable, and that's a theme that will emerge, the variability due to the user and the characteristics of the user as well as the products. And then just to come back to cigarettes now, just to keep that context. So we know there's more than 7,000 chemicals in cigarette smoke. Constituents of e-cigarette vapor number in the hundreds. So, you know, and I've not kept up on the literature on this. Recent paper I looked at said they found 200 different chemicals in e-cigarettes. So obviously that number is not a small number and cause for concern, but when we look compared to combustible tobacco cigarettes, it's a much smaller number. In terms of the toxicology then, there's substantial evidence that under typical conditions of use, exposure to potentially toxic substances from e-cigarettes is significantly lower compared with cigarettes. And that's buttressed by the numbers and also by the content of what's been found in the aerosol so far. Nicotine, conclusive evidence that exposure to nicotine from e-cigarettes is highly variable. Substantial intake evidence that nicotine intake from e-cigarette devices among experienced adult users can be comparable to cigarettes. And clearly this is an area now where this was the pre-pod-based systems, where this is an area that things have changed quite a bit in terms of the nicotine delivery. And this focus here on adult users, really interested to hear and really glad he's here, Luca Kennard, to hear a young person's experience with these pod-based systems. And that gets into an area where the 2018 report is out of date. debate, I believed, and Dr. Thrasher alluded to this, the pod systems with the nicotine salts versus the cigarettes with the free-base nicotine really seems to ramp up the ability to deliver quantities of nicotine and achieve a level of addictiveness that we've never seen before with combustible tobacco cigarettes, to the extent that it can really be debilitating to people's lives. Metals, I didn't talk about metals as a constituent of the e-liquid, so where do you think the metals are coming from in the vapor? Any ideas? Heating coil. So there's a metal heating coil that creates the vapor. So you've got the e-liquid coming over a heating coil to create the aerosol vapor, and then there's metals in the heating coil, and that's leading to exposure to more harmful agents that were just in the liquid. So substantial evidence that e-cigarette aerosol contains metals. Limited evidence that the number of metals in e-cigarette aerosol could be greater than the number of metals in cigarettes. So again, that's a source of concern, that balance of e-cigarettes versus combustible tobacco cigarettes. On the metal category, there's the potential that e-cigarettes could be worse than combustible tobacco cigarettes. Secondhand vape exposure, conclusive evidence that e-cigarette use increases airborne concentrations of particulate matter and nicotine in indoor environments compared with background levels. And then we've got the comparison with the secondhand smoke from cigarettes. Moderate evidence that secondhand exposure to nicotine and particulates is lower from e-cigarettes compared with combustible tobacco cigarettes. So that's the constituents of the what's in the aerosol delivered to the user, and also the secondhand vape. And then what do we know about the health effects of e-cigarettes? And that's where we get into some key issues. I would just like to raise this issue of exposure variability between the products and the variability between the users, as I had previously mentioned. And then a key issue for the public health implications is compared to what? And that's where there's a lot of controversy in many forums about how e-cigarettes are viewed. And I think some of it comes down to the question of, well, what are we asking? And so one question is compared to no tobacco products at all. So e-cigarettes compared to ambient air, and that would lead to one set of answer to a specific question. The other is compared to combustible tobacco cigarettes. And ideally, the research moving forward, particularly that coming out of laboratories that is focused on only one side of those questions, it's very helpful to have evidence from similarly designed studies that address both sides of the equation in order to determine the health effects and get the evidence we need to fully understand the public health implications. So another big question that leads to a lot of a debate, I think, based on beliefs, but in the absence of evidence at the current time, is how much less harmful are e-cigarettes compared to combustible tobacco cigarettes? So I just drew two scenarios here. In the top scenario, e-cigarettes are right in the middle between the air we breathe and combustible tobacco cigarettes, so 50% less harmful. The lower scenario would be 95% less risk than combustible tobacco cigarettes. Where does the truth lie? We don't know really at the present time, but we're surely confident that e-cigarettes are less harmful than combustible tobacco cigarettes, and I think that's important information for you to understand. It may not be what you'd want to advertise to the youth, but that's something that you need to be honest with the youth about, of where the truth lies. So being a new exposure, Dr. Kilpatrick mentioned latent period and how long we have to wait from an exposure for a chronic disease like cancer to occur. We know that's a multi-step process that takes decades to occur. Can we accelerate the pace of research and rely on intermediate biomarkers? Certainly there should be funding invested in those areas, but for these major chronic diseases shown here, no evidence to assess at this time. For cardiovascular diseases, if we look at related endpoints, substantial evidence that heart rate increases after nicotine intake from e-cigarettes, moderate evidence that diastolic blood pressure increases after nicotine intake from e-cigarettes. If we look at cancers and the biologic plausibility of if e-cigarettes could lead to cancer, there's substantial evidence that some chemicals present in e-cigarette aerosols are capable of causing DNA damage and mutagenesis. And you should know that cancer is ultimately a disease of DNA damage. And the question is whether or not the levels of exposure to the user are high enough to contribute to human carcinogenesis. So a specific question remains to be answered. If we look at modes of action, such as oxidative stress or acute endothelial cell dysfunction, those are short-term markers that can be measured in e-cigarette users. And there's substantial evidence that e-cigarette use does induce acute endothelial cell dysfunction and does promote the formation of reactive oxygen species and oxidative stress. So the importance of this, I think this has important implications for young people. This also occurs for, as you might imagine, for combustible tobacco cigarette smoking, and I don't think we've ever fully capitalized in our messages to youth about the short-term health implications. So markers like increased oxidative stress are what part of what goes into diminished health status. So if youth is an athlete, for example, the use of e-cigarettes and this increased levels of oxidative stress would be reducing performance, not enhancing performance, for example. Dependence and abuse liability, substantial evidence that e-cigarette use results in symptoms of dependence on e-cigarettes themselves. And again, this looks very cautious in comparison to the what we're seeing now with the pod-based systems and the levels of dependence that we're seeing. Respiratory disease, moderate evidence for increased cough and wheeze in adolescents who use e-cigarettes, and an association with e-cigarette use and increase in asthma exacerbations. So again, more short-term, and this evidence is solid evidence. There were a number of studies. It's cross-sectional in nature, so not the highest level of evidence, but seen many times in many different populations. It's what one would expect to see based on cigarette smoking, and this kind of association is teaching me new things about the impact of nicotine. I would not have expected to see these associations. I always thought it was the smoke and inhaling the smoke that was causing these upper respiratory short-term symptoms, but nicotine induces these symptoms. Injuries and poisonings, conclusive evidence that e-cigarette devices can explode and cause burns and projectile injuries, especially when batteries are of poor quality or being modified by users. Exposure to e-liquids, either drinking, eye contact, or dermal contact can result in adverse health effects and can result in death. So health effects bottom line, e-cigarettes contains fewer numbers and lower levels of toxic substances than combustible tobacco cigarettes. The health risks of e-cigarettes are likely to be substantially less than e-cigarettes or than combustible tobacco cigarettes, but we don't know how much less. And e-cigarettes have health risks, and I think that CDC has a really nice slogan that I really admire and have now adopted myself. Safer does not mean safe. So it is, where we are in the spectrum between combustible tobacco cigarettes and no tobacco products at all, wherever we are, e-cigarettes are not safe products. The long-term health effects of e-cigarettes are uncertain at the present time. And then in wrapping up, I just wanted to address the critical issue in my mind of e-cigarettes in relation to use of combustible tobacco cigarettes, and look at this question both from a perspective of youth and for adults. So two big questions. What are the impact of uptake of cigarette smoking in youth and young adults of e-cigarette use? And then what's the impact on smoking cessation among addicted smokers? Two different questions, two different bodies of evidence. Both of these have been alluded to by the prior speakers. So to look at the question of e-cigarette use in relation to combustible tobacco cigarette use, this is what a study would look like. A prospective cohort study, you start with all never smokers. find out who's using e-cigarettes and who's not using e-cigarettes, follow up over time for the, and measure whether or not those individuals went on to smoke combustible tobacco cigarettes or not. So I just wanted to provide the framework there of the evidence I'll show on not this slide, but the following slide. So our committee concluded that there was substantial evidence that among never smokers, e-cigarette use increases the risk of ever smoking cigarettes among youth and young adults. And this is one where I'm going to actually show you the data because there's a lot of controversy about what this conclusion means and how to interpret it. So these are the results, and you won't be able to see every one, but we had 10 prospective cohort studies to look at that time. More have been published since that time, continuing to show the same thing. Sample sizes ranging from about 300 to 3,700, conducted in various locations in the United States and Europe. And then ages at baseline varied from 11 years old to young adults, so age of ages. And then the follow-up period was from 1 year to 1.5 years for the measurement of cigarette smoking. And those numbers on the far right-hand column are relative risks of going on to become an ever user of combustible tobacco cigarettes for those who had used e-cigarettes compared to those who had never used e-cigarettes. And what those numbers show, they're all greater than 1, meaning that e-cigarette use is in the risk direction. Most of them are substantially greater than 1. The median here would be about greater than a 3-fold elevated risk of going on to try a combustible tobacco cigarette. They're all statistically significant. And as an epidemiologist, to me, this is a large, consistent body of evidence showing a strong association that this is a major concern. But on the other hand, it could be interpreted by others and has been as saying those youth who start with e-cigarettes are risk takers. They're the ones who are going to be more likely to just try other substances in general. So what if they go on to try combustible tobacco cigarettes? Do they really progress to become cigarette smokers? And so fair enough, that's a fair question. So we did, as a committee, address that issue of whether e-cigarettes were associated with the likelihood of smoking progression, and made the conclusion that there was moderate evidence that e-cigarette use increases the frequency and intensity of subsequent combustible tobacco cigarette smoking. I don't have the evidence to show you there, and to be honest, I haven't kept up with the extent of the evidence. The reason this was rated as moderate is there was fewer studies available. They were all consistent and all showed strong association. So this is a source, personally, when I think of the public health consequences of major concern, because think back now to the reason we're all here of what led to this organization was combustible tobacco cigarettes, the extent of the harms, and if e-cigarettes are truly associated with the likelihood of progressing to combustible tobacco cigarette smoking, that's a major public health detriment beyond imagining. But others argue that, again, that this is could be diverting individuals, and more likely than not, we're continuing to see, you saw the population levels and continued decreases in combustible tobacco cigarette smoking. If these associations are true, we would expect to start to see an uptick in the near future in combustible tobacco cigarette smoking. We have not seen that yet. So now what about e-cigarettes and adult smoking cessation? And again, we're here to talk about youth today, but this may be relevant to loved ones in your family. It may be relevant to your specific career. And I think for thinking public health consequences, we need to pull in this. This is not a conclusion of the committee. I'm now rating this evidence as strong evidence from randomized controlled trials that electronic cigarettes with nicotine are as or more effective than nicotine replacement therapy products for smoking cessation. And that's based on there's other evidence out there, but essentially 2 trials, and predominantly the more recent one, the HAJAC study on the bottom, published in the New England Journal of Medicine in January, randomized trial of smokers who were interested in quitting, randomized to e-cigarettes or to a menu of options of nicotine replacement therapies for them to use at their choice, what they wanted to use, followed up for 1 year on a 1.8-fold greater likelihood of quitting smoking at the end of a year in those randomized to e-cigarettes compared to the evidence-based nicotine replacement therapy. So clear winner, actually more efficacious than nicotine replacement therapies for cessation. And so as in part of my world, I've been asked to write about that and interpret that because there are physicians in the clinic and other healthcare providers in the clinic every day being asked by smokers, what should I do? I'd like to quit. Can I use e-cigarettes for quitting? And what is good clinical advice at the present time given this evidence? Well, it's not yet part of evidence-based guidelines, so I have to put that caveat in there. But I think if you have smokers who are willing to quit by any means, there's no question you stick with the proven evidence-based therapies such as nicotine replacement therapy that don't have the harms of e-cigarettes. So we'd never be thinking of e-cigarettes as a frontline therapy for smoking cessation because of the constituents and the harms we already know about in them compared to what's on the market. But if we have smokers who are only willing to quit using electronic cigarettes, and those scenarios that come up, and I interact with physicians frequently, are those smokers who have tried everything else. They've tried every evidence-based therapy and have been unable to quit, and they want to try quitting using e-cigarettes, or they won't, or there are smokers who don't want to try those others. They want to try e-cigarettes. Then I believe that it's prudent advice to support them in that decision because a lifetime on e-cigarettes, even compared to combustible tobacco cigarettes, would produce considerable harm reduction if we're thinking in the harm reduction framework. So bottom line, among youth, substantial evidence that e-cigarette use increases the risk of transitioning to cigarette smoking, a source of major concern to that. And I know that's controversial in terms of the interpretation of what that means. And among adults, strong evidence that e-cigarettes can be efficacious for helping adults quit cigarette smoking. So summary, e-cigarettes contain toxic substances. The exposure is less than for e-cigarettes than combustible tobacco cigarettes. E-cigarettes have health risks, and the long-term health effects of e-cigarettes are not yet clear, but are likely to be substantially less than for combustible tobacco cigarettes. A major known concern is that youth who use e-cigarettes have a much greater risk of going on to use combustible tobacco cigarettes. So with that, I'll conclude, and I think then we will now have our panel discussion and an opportunity for you to ask your questions and make your comments.